Hi, I'm Flintlock of Tomahawk Productions, and today we're going to be talking about the Hessians, the German soldiers who served in the American War for Independence. And with me, I have Feldmarschall Material Culture here. He runs a Facebook page by the same name. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit more?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Marshall Beresford. I run and operate the Facebook page Feldmarschall Material Culture. I'm a young, aspiring 18th century artisan wanting to make things from the military and civilian, the military and civilian uh, ensemble. Anything like that interests me. Going to museums, looking at originals, and sort of getting hands on with stuff and making things rather than something simply reenactment. Try and do it a little bit more one to one. I've kind of floated around in the 18th century German sphere at the minute, and one of my big interests is the Hessians and the German auxiliaries in the American Revolution, and it's kind of what I've made a little bit of a name for myself with at the minute. It seems.
So, in order to start out, I wanted to ask you first and foremost, who are the Hessians?
So it's a bit of a difficult question to answer. So when both in period and from history books from sort of our turn of the century, sort of a little bit out of date historiography. Hessians tends to refer to collectively the six German states which provided subsidized troops and auxiliaries to the British Army in North America. They're mainly called Hessians collectively because the largest bulk of them came from Hesse-Kassel or Hessen-Kassel, along with another province called Hesse-Hanau. But the other four states are Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, Waldeck, Ansbach-Bahut, and now Germans also served in a greater capacity in the American Revolution and the larger conflict that it escalated into. For instance, King George, who was the elector of Hanover, was an absolute monarch there and could actually implement a lot of domestic policies there, which influenced the British foreign policy at home. One of which was the recruitment of Hanoverians into the British Army proper, wherein which they were largely put into one or two individuals to make up the ranks for a company. Or in the case of some instances, like the 17th Regiment of Foot, the colonel's company was entirely made of Hanoverians. Hanoverians also significantly garrisoned India during this period, and also held Gibraltar quite famously against the Spanish.
Awesome. And you mentioned a lot with our turn of the century or our more bicentennial era historiography. The word mercenary is constantly passed around. Oh, the Hessians were bloodthirsty mercenaries. They're paid to kill, they're born to kill. And well, some nowadays we have some modern scholars who are saying that they are not in fact mercenaries, that it would be better to refer to them as something like subsidy troops or simply just as paid auxiliaries. What do you think about that? Are the Hessians mercenaries?
So it's an incredibly nuanced subject, in my opinion. The common line now is that mercenary is kind of an inappropriate term. It's a little bit reductive. It also kind of invokes this idea of like the fantasy sellsword, like the rugged individual who's going out on his own. And people are worried that can kind of give the wrong impression. But from a completely legalese point of view, and a factual point of view, they are a paid auxiliary, as you said, operating in conjunction with the British Army. Now, you know, that's all well and good, but the word mercenary is used in a contemporary sense mainly by its detractors as a pejorative. So the Declaration of Independence, I believe it's point 14, which says he being George III, he at this time is currently importing foreign mercenaries to make war upon us, paraphrasing that. Um, and the term mercenary is also used by people like, I think it's John Adams uses it, Continental Congress invoke it a lot. A lot of its critics in Parliament back home in Britain are using the term as well. It's a very emotively charged word, so in my opinion, a group of people who don't have an emotive attachment to the conflict coming in and helping out for money. It does sort of stir up that name. But that being said, this is a legitimized institution that's been going on for 100 or so years. In Germany, it's called the Soldatenhandel, or the soldier trade. And Britain in particular had a relation with Hessen Castle for well over 100 years by this point, or close to 100 years. So it was very much a legitimate way for smaller states to make money, to escape poverty. It also kind of conjures the like notions of the absolutist ruler who's kind of brutal to his citizens and subjects. Talking about Hessians in particular rather than the other states, so I'm talking about Hessians proper. Landgraf Frederick II of Hessen Castle was an all right monarch. For the period, he was an absolutist. The funds from the American Revolution funded public infrastructure projects, and men were largely looked after. But again, there's a lot of bad historiography that's kind of coming out to, like, for instance, a very famously penned letter that Landgraf said that basically his men were worth more dead to him than alive. And it kind of, that sort of brutal idea of, oh, wow, he wants to kill these guys to get more money. They're very bloodthirsty warlords. It's the general consensus that letter's now fake and kind of ties into a lot of the early American Federalist creation myths. But are they mercenaries? If you're hiring them, they're, honorable auxiliaries. If you're fighting against them, they're barbaric mercenaries. So yes and no, in my opinion.
Awesome. So I think shifting over more from the general broad questions about Hessians, where they're from, who they are, basically. What is your uniform like? You're obviously here in a Hessian uniform.
Oh yeah.
You want to tell us a bit more about that, about what their uniforms are like?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a big material culture nerd, and hopefully, I imagine your fans are as well. So we'll dive into this. So you have the basic outline of the 18th century soldier. Nothing is that particular odd compared to it from a more anglicized version or American version. Everything's virtually still there, but a little bit different and tweaked in its organization and structure, which affects the kit. So I'll just start what I have here. So I'm wearing a shirt, obviously, standard civilian, we have lots of, we have in particular an example of a Swedish shirt, which is sort of a very coarse, heavier linen, not as finely worked, not gathered at all much, very sort of plain Jane. But the Hessians in particular, we have a source which is Prussian origin, so we're not quite sure if it's appropriate for Hessians per se. That's a big case with a lot of Hessian stuff, is we have to rely on Prussian examples. Something cool, I believe it's called a Camisole, which is a half shirt. So basically it's a shirt without the arms, just with a shorter front and a longer back, which would imply that either their waistcoats might have been attached with sleeves, or they would have had just bare arms underneath. It's kind of an ongoing discussion, so I couldn't really comment on that. But that then brings me to the waistcoat. Typically, the colour of facings, though sometimes not. Pewter and brass buttons, or white metal rather, feature equally. Buttons tend to be lipped. Sometimes they're domed. There's a lot of examples. The Red Bank excavations that are recently going on have actually uncovered some buttons, which have actually proved some of our ideas on what these buttons would look like. So that's quite useful. I'm also wearing a stock here. Interestingly, red wool with a false collar on top. We don't know if it's a false collar or the actual shirt poking out. There is a sketch by Adolf Menzel, who's painted a lot of Prussian soldiers, and we see on a washing line a very clear example of a tied stock with a fake a collar on top. With more contemporary Hessian sources, we actually see buckles on the back in the Brown University collection of side-on pictures. We can see a very evident brass buckle. So I'll have to update my kit with that research. Another thing that you can see on me at the minute is the hair. I've got 2 buckles in the side of my head, and my rat tail, or Zoft, I believe it's called, usually goes around to the mid-back. Now, the Q is sort of brought up in these connotations of it's associated with the age of the soldier, so the length of service along the Q. You sort of get into a little bit of reenactorism there. I've not, verified that, but I get where that's coming from. In the diary of a soldier from von Donop, which is the regiment I betray, from von Kraft, he talks about in '78, since Philadelphia, we are to wear hairlocks again, which we don't ultimately know if that means a fake zobt or fake buckles or a full wig or both or separate individual pieces. It's a little bit in the air, but there's some evidence to suggest that they didn't all have naturally long hair all of the time. I'm also wearing a musketeer's hat. The battalion companies of a Hessian battalion would have cocked hats. They would usually have these pom-poms or pushers, one at each side, and then sort of one sticking out the top. We have an example of a Prussian one, which is bound with one piece of lace or string on each side, so only one rather than 2. We do see some examples of Prussians having multiple, and sort of a single button there. Another thing which delineates rank and position in the company is the sword knot. So I'll just get the sword. So this is an infantry sabre 1740, as they're typically called. It's basically the sort of Anglo-Germanic sword of the period. They all very much look the very, very same, with a knuckle and a heart-shaped guard, and a sort of thing at the end there. And around the handle is a wrapped sword knot, or a porte-piece, I believe they're called. And the type of knot would denote who someone was in the battalion. So the Grenadiers, for example, would have black sword knots at the end, and one of the battalion companies would have a white one, and the others would be red and blue, yellow, etc. But another distinguishing, actually, no point in really show. Why not show it off for everyone? So, sadly, none of the FR markings that would be on them. I believe a lot of these were produced in Kassel themselves, but I imagine some of them were imported. One of the big weapons manufacturers in Hesse-Kassel was a factory called Pistor. I believe there's another one called Schmackhalden or Schmackhal. I might be getting that wrong. And they produced a variant of what we would call the Potsdam musket, or a sort of German Protestant-style musket, which very much looks the same as a Bess, except for some of the furnishings are a bit different. I don't really think I can show you that, but on the neck there we have an FR, which, with this being a Prussian musket, would actually be Frederikus Rex for Frederick the Great, but let's just say that this is a musket from the first, from King Frederick of Sweden, who was the Landgraf's, I believe, great uncle. It's a bit of an old one. We also have an interesting attachment of the sling here. We have sort of a knot wrapped up around the hammer of the prison, and we see a little interesting Haturhen, or hanger, which loops the sling around the knuckle guard, where it can be removed easily on a catch. It's a little bit cutting edge, and we have an example of that from, I believe, the Paris University exposition in this early 20th century. Another interesting feature is that the bayonet lug, which in this case is actually a bayonet lug because it can't be used as a sight, it's actually underneath the barrel. So its whole purpose is a lug. It does have a brazed on brass sight here, if you can sort of see that. So it's a very interesting design for people that aren't used to looking at sort of more Anglo-style muskets. Of course, that features into the aspect of linear warfare that we're all familiar with, which is I believe the bayonet is elsewhere, but everyone knows what a bayonet looks like. But typically those accoutrements are held in red leather. But a musket is nothing without a cartridge pouch. This is an example of a Grenadiers cartridge pouch. In the middle, we have the Hessen Lau with the initials FLZH for Friedrich Landgraf zu Hessen, so Frederick Landgraf of Hesse. We also see, because it's a Grenadier pouch, we see 4 Grenadiers. We see these in a lot of boxes from both Hessian regiments and also Prussians. This particular cipher is accredited to, I believe, von Bose, and excavated at Redoubt. I don't know which Redoubt, but there's 2 there. One is attributed to Bose and one is attributed to the Erpins regiment. I've simply gone with the Bose design because it's a lot more. It looks a lot more more standardized than, say, the more fanciful one of the Erpins, which is equivalent to the Hereditary Prince regiment. These are quite substantial as well compared to British counterparts. They're incredibly deep. I believe they can hold up to 60 rounds. This has a leather insert which can hold up to 30, and you could stack 2 of those on top of each other. So it's quite a big package here, and also a little pouch here for flints and things, and a very notably broad accoutrements band. This is 3 inches, I believe, wide, or 2.75, I think. It's definitely noticeable when you compare it to others. Finishing off the other accoutrements, we have a very standard-looking belt. No different, really, from any other sort of military belt of the era, except in the drawings from a Prussian guy called, I think, von Schmatau, we have a great illustration of this thing, which is a catch. So instead of actually buckling your belt, you just sort of unhook it. It's very practical, for me anyway. We have accounts, not of Hessian soldiers, but of Ansbach bei Hut soldiers in New York, actually slinging them over their shoulder on a march, along with having personal canteens. But again, no Hessians doing that. But people do say the Hessians didn't adapt their gear as much, a little bit more stoically. But again, we're sort of treading into a bit of a commonly cited reenactorism. What is quite unique and fits in with the sort of Prussian style of organization is the Feldmarschall, which is a humongous, I believe, around 2-liter sized canteen, which has a stopper at the top, which is commonly cited as a way to ration out water between a mess of 6. And I believe there'd be 2 per tent mess. And they're quite substantial. The regulations of the period specify being carried on a leather belt. Not necessarily on white, but it specializes white for the Brotbeutel, which is the haversack or bread bag. Sadly, I don't have one on me at the minute, which is appropriate, as I only have one with a linen strap, which isn't quite accurate for Hessen Castle for this period, but I'll just show that real quick. Very small compared to the British one as well, quite notably. Another piece of kit which is quite distinctive is the tornister, which is the knapsack. Again, a lot smaller. You could very barely fit your extra necessaries in here. 2 buckles. There are quite some shoddy extents where they're quite asymmetrical as well, which is kind of funny thinking about how we obsess over things. But this one, made by Thomas Philippe, is very good and immaculate. Proper cow calf, hairy, quite nice for keeping off water. But before we move on to the something a bit more talking about ranks, one thing that's a bit more distinctive than, say, musketeer are the Grenadiers. So the famous Hessian Grenadier cap of von Donop. We see Mars sitting on a field with the accoutrements of war, cannons surrounding him, flags, captured pinions, and standards and flags. Upon a blue field, we have the cipher FL, again, Friedrich Landgraf. Behind, we have the bag with some regimental tape and grenades at the back. There do exist fusiliers in the Hessians, in the Hessian army. They have a slightly smaller version of the brass cap. It could be silver, tin. And they effectively function the same as fusiliers would in other armies at the time. They're basically more a prestigious, historied regiment with more prestige to them. Again, typically being of some prominence, like the Prince Regiment, or particularly famous or old regiments that go back to sort of the late Python shop eras of the 17th century. A very iconic piece of Hessian gear that we have as well are the long gaiters. I've based my one on Prussian extant ones, which have, I believe, 15 buttons with brass buttons. In some illustrations, we have examples of ones with, I think, up to 40. I think we have to take a bit of a pinch of salt with that. Though there are some extant British gaiters with a similar amount of buttons, but brass ones I couldn't quite justify. So sadly, no. Another piece of legwear that we have as well, which we know that they wore, were gaitered trousers. Again, we talk about how the Hessians didn't adapt their gear. Well, they did. Von Bose in the south famously wore their sort of burgundy brown woolen ones. Also, we hear about it von Kraft of von Donop when he's a sergeant, I believe, at that time, or a lieutenant. And he's been told they have to wear them. So, granted, the war's over, but they're still in America. Oh yes, another iconic piece, which is sort of a more conservative holdover from the mid-century, is the Nackmütze or the Schleppmütze or Zveltmütze. So nightcap, tent cap. It's basically just a triangle, isometric with a pom-pom. Isometric? It's a triangle regardless. And basically just a Santa hat with, we believe, blue with the facing colour. There's very scant evidence of these in contemporary illustrations. We do have a couple, so they're largely entirely conjectural. Sometimes we think it's the reverse. We know they were ordered to be made from the remnants of coats, regardless. I believe the last thing on our list here of any prominence is the coat. So the coat, of course, is cut very much in the Prussian style. So it's a bit more more mid-century looking. So, for instance, the coats do vary a lot per regiment. Some have lapels, some don't have lapels. Brass buttons, pewter buttons, bound buttonholes. There's a lot of variation. But this particular one doesn't feature a collar. In fact, the only regiment I believe that features a collar of a sort of British sort of American style is the Jaegers. They interestingly have very English-inspired coats with English cuffs, quite rounded and tubular. We have, the strap at the back, typically being of the facing colour. Von Bose has a Strawbauch, or a straw-coloured facing, lined in a madder red bay. It also features very distinctive Brandenburg cuffs. So sort of like you have the seam here, seam at the top, and then flap that comes down. This one is fake. There are some real ones which are made properly in the 1786 collection from Frederick the Great's funeral, which we have a lot of coats of, but we have to be careful when we extrapolate those to a 1770s Hessian context. But more innovations have been made and more research has been done since I've made this project, so I might need to update a few things on this kit. And I believe, and some regimental tape on the bottom, so a lot less lacy. The only real regiments that feature a preeminence of lace, the Guards have quite a lot, but a couple like Vatagu and Hol do as well. So there's a lot of diversity and less standardization of kit and uniform in the Hessian Corps in North America, to be sure. So I think that covers everything that I've got beside me.
Yeah, with the coats, as you mentioned, they take a lot of influence from the Prussian army. The Hessians in general do take a lot of influence from the Prussian army. Are there any of the other six states that take other cues from their uniforms? Are their uniforms similar, or do we see other variations within?
Well, largely, I'd say yes, but there are some exceptions. The Prussian style of uniform dominated the design of a lot of the other states of sort of Protestant Germany at the time. Um, so, for instance, Brunswick uniforms are very similar. They do have distinctive Swedish cuffs on some of theirs, so maybe a bit more Swedish northern influence there in styling, in diplomacy, because who these countries interact with um, tend to influence these little subtle fashion decisions in some zeitgeist kind of way, less intentional, more carry on. Um, Notably, with the other four nations, Anhalt-Zerbst in particular is a lot more sort of Eastern inspired. So its uniforms are well not Eastern inspired, more Austrian inspired rather. So that they're white, which is very starkly Austrian. And I believe they have more sort of Austrian style muskets as well. They also have bearskins. I believe they're the only one that actually utilizes bearskins at the time. And I think they import them from Russia because they're very close allies with them. Famously, a princess of Anhalt-Zerbst was Catherine the Great, who went on to be, one of Russia's preeminent monarchs of that period. Uh, I think the other states there, um, I can't really think of anything else of the other states. They largely follow that sort of Prussian model. A lot of these rulers and military men sort of hopped around nations a lot and brought with them that past experience. And a lot of them had come from Prussia or at least had interacted with Prussians in some conflict in the 18th century. So it kind of became more drawn towards kind of in the same aspect that like American uniforms very much mimic those of Britain.
All right. Well, I think I just have one more big thing. And you're not wearing it today. There are some images of you wearing it. Mustaches. We see them
Ah,
all
yeah.
the time. If everybody in the progressive community or the progressive American War for Independence community says, "Oh yeah, if you want to have a mustache or if you want to keep your mustache, you got to be a German." Is that true?
Well, sadly, yeah, mine's ran off. Cecil, as everyone likes to call him. Yeah, so the mustaches are, from my understanding, in this period, distinctively for the Grenadiers. We sometimes see mustaches appearing in Prussian and German Protestant armies in the 1730s and the 1740s, and you see them in the battalion sometimes. I've got an image of my head in my head of a non-uniform mustache. So it's like some in the battalion have them and some don't as a personal thing. I can't quite say with certainty if that's correct. But by this period, there is virtually no illustration or account that I'm aware of which features a Hessian who's not a grenadier with a mustache, and they're distinctively, um, you know, for the German grenadiers. Um, well, at least for the Hessian grenadiers. There's an account regarding the Brunswickers, I believe. I believe it's in Lady Riedesel's diary, who was the wife of the leader of the Brunswick Corps during the Saratoga campaign, um, where someone had inquired as to the religion of our grenadiers on account of their mustaches, because the mustaches originally for the grenadiers came from that sort of Ottoman janissary image, which is invoked when the grenadiers came into existence around the late pike and shot era in the late 17th century. And so for the sort of Anglo Americans to see them was kind of like, oh, geez, like this is very outlandish and sort of oriental to us. It's very and it sort of plays into the a lot of the fears and propaganda that you see against the Hessians in the colonies. So for instance, they have very exaggerated, massive, huge ones, and it sort of plays up this image of the tyrannical barbarian foreign invader archetype. So yeah.
Well, awesome. All right. Well, we don't have a whole lot of time left. So I think I'm going to close it out here. Marshall, once again, I thank you for taking the time out of your day, especially living out in the UK, being one of the few American Revolutionary War reenactors in the United Kingdom. The time difference especially made this sort of difficult to work out, but I'm glad that you could come. As always, viewers, I am Flintlock and Tomahawk Productions. Once again, I am here. This has been a video on the Hessians, and I am signing out.